Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a quiet journey into something often forgotten, the hidden weight of a golden crown. When we picture a king, it's easy to imagine the glory, the jewels, the silk, the power that seemed to stretch across the known world. But beneath all that shimmer was something colder. A crown, after all, is not just gold, it's metal, and metal is heavy. It presses down on the skull, it leaves marks, and the men who wore it were never quite free of its weight. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like for those who ruled. Not the stories written by flattery or fear, but the quiet, human truth of kingship. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like candlelight flickering across the stones of an empty hall. Before we start, a small favor. If you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you truly enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of listeners, scattered across the world, drifting off to the same tale under different skies. Now, let's begin. Picture a hall, vast and echoing. Marble pillars vanish into shadow. Torches hiss against damp air. At the center, a throne, carved from oak, layered with gold, so heavy it takes 6 men to move it. And on that throne sits a figure, draped in velvet. The courtiers bow. The guards do not blink. Somewhere far beyond these walls, a bell tolls the hour. The king nods once, and an entire room breathes again. It all looks magnificent from a distance, but if you were to step closer, if you could see past the glittering surface, you might notice something else. The tired curve of his shoulders, the pale outline where the crown has rubbed against his temples, and the quiet fear in his eyes, that single human fear that everything could slip away. We tend to imagine kings as gods of their own worlds, but the truth is, many of them were prisoners of expectation, of paranoia, of 1,000 unseen rules. From the moment a child was born into royalty, their life stopped being their own. Every smile was rehearsed, every gesture watched, every word measured. A wrong glance could start a rumor could start a war. You see, kings didn't wake up and decide things freely. They woke up to schedules thicker than any monk's prayers. They were told when to eat, when to speak, when to walk through the hall so that sunlight hit their face at just the right angle. Proof, supposedly, of divine favor. Even their sleep wasn't private. Servants crept through bedchambers at night, checking coals, adjusting drapes, ensuring that His Majesty didn't freeze or suffocate. The irony is almost poetic. The most powerful man in the kingdom never slept alone, never truly rested. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The rustle of tapestries in the draught, the faint clang of armor in the corridor, the murmur of servants moving like ghosts, trying not to be seen. In the corner, a scribe scratches away with his quill, recording everything. The king's mood, the temperature of the room, the number of dishes served at supper. Nothing goes unwritten. Even silence was documented. And somewhere, amid all that silence, the king wonders, would anyone still bow if they saw me without this robe? Would they listen if my crown were gone? Royal power, for all its pomp, was a performance. To be king was to play a role every waking hour. The costume was dazzling, ermine-lined cloaks, jeweled belts, boots soft as cloud. But the script was suffocating. A king could never show weakness, never cry, never laugh too long. Even joy had to be measured, polished, approved by tradition. Every feast, every audience, every procession was theatre, and everyone knew their lines. The courtiers smiled, the nobles flattered, and the king pretended to believe them. It wasn't malice, it was survival. One of my favorite old chronicles describes a coronation in painfully slow detail. The priest anoints the young ruler's forehead with holy oil. The choir sings until their voices crack. Trumpets blast. Gold dust fills the air like mist. The crowd cheers. Long live the king. But the boy, he's only 16, looks terrified. He keeps glancing at his father's empty throne as if expecting it to come alive and tell him what to do next. That's how it often was. Power didn't arrive as thunder. It arrived as dread. Imagine being told that God himself had chosen you, and then realizing, moments later, that every famine, every war, every plague that follows will somehow be your fault. There's something almost tragic about the royal morning routine. At dawn, servants pull open the curtains. Light spills in, too bright, too soon. The king's personal attendants enter, one by one, each performing their small piece of ritual. One washes the royal hands, another dresses the king's hair, a third presents the mirror. The monarch stands silent while his body is transformed into an icon. He can't speak freely to them, not out of cruelty, but because hierarchy forbids it. If he does, word spreads. The king spoke to a valet today. He must be lonely. Even loneliness could be used as gossip. Breakfast is eaten under watchful eyes. Food tasters sample every bite first. Even the silverware gleams suspiciously. And as the king lifts his cup, he might wonder, how many people in this room would smile if he didn't wake tomorrow? That's the hidden truth behind royal portraits. Those paintings we see in museums, where every brushstroke screams control, the perfect posture, the calm, impossible gaze, the hand resting gently on the scepter, as if nothing could shake it. But behind that image was a person, one who got sick, who aged, who doubted, one who couldn't show those things, because to do so was dangerous. A king who coughed too much was whispered to be cursed. A king who mourned too deeply might be seen as weak. Even grief had to be disguised with ceremony. You could have walked through a royal palace at night. You might have felt the loneliness in the walls themselves. Every footstep echoes. Every door is guarded. Even the wind seems to move carefully. Somewhere down a long corridor, a musician plays softly, a lute, or maybe a harp, but no one's listening. He's just filling the silence. In a high chamber, the king sits at a writing desk. No crown, no courtiers, just candlelight and parchment. He writes to no one in particular, maybe to God, maybe to himself. The words are plain. I am weary of being feared. You can almost feel that exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep cures, but the kind that seeps into the soul. The endless balancing of power and mercy, pride and guilt. One wrong decree could spark rebellion. One show of mercy could invite betrayal. It's strange, isn't it? The people feared their king, and the king feared his people, each trapped in the same web, each pretending the other was the threat. That's what made the crown heavy. It wasn't the gold or the jewels. It was the distance it created between one human and everyone else. Sometimes I imagine a moment that never made it into the chronicles. A king, somewhere in the medieval world, slipping out to the courtyard just before dawn. He walks alone, his robe dragging through the dew. For once, there's no ceremony, no escort, no audience. Just the sound of his own breath in the morning fog. He looks up, sees the same stars his peasants see, and maybe, just for a heartbeat, feels equal to them. Then the guards find him, bow, and escort him back inside. The spell is broken, the performance resumes, but the same quiet truth lingered beneath it all. Being king meant carrying a loneliness no crown could hide. So the next time you see one of those old portraits, a solemn face surrounded by velvet and gold, look closer. See the faint crease around the eyes, the tiny sadness in the mouth. That's not boredom. That's the look of someone who's been worshipped too long to feel human. That was the beginning, the moment when power began to feel less like privilege and more like burden. The story of kingship, as we'll see, is not a tale of constant triumph, but of constant weight. In the next quiet stretch of this journey, we'll drift deeper into the rituals, the endless performances that ruled their days, and the strange loneliness of living in constant ceremony. But for now, let's linger here, in that candlelit hall, where the crown gleams like a star that can't go out, and the man beneath it wonders what it might feel like to simply be free. Morning in the palace begins not with the sun, but with footsteps. Soft, deliberate, echoing off stone floors polished so often you can see your reflection in them. The air smells faintly of smoke and lavender. Somewhere down the corridor, a chamberlain clears his throat, the signal that the king's day is about to begin. Ceremony does not wait for comfort. It begins before the king opens his eyes. A servant approaches the royal bed with the reverence of a priest. The curtains are drawn open to let in light, filtered through stained glass that paints the room in colours too bright for such an early hour. The king blinks, half awake, and there they already stand, chamberlains, valets, advisors, guards, each with their tiny role in the grand machine of monarchy. He is not greeted as a man waking from sleep, but as a symbol being reassembled for the day. The first robe must be placed just so, the rings adjusted in their precise order, even the crown, though it might not yet rest on his head, waits nearby on a red cushion, its silent reminder that his body is not entirely his own. Every act of the morning is a ritual. A servant kneels to pour water into a golden basin. Another presents a towel embroidered with the royal crest. The king washes his hands in front of them all, not because he must, but because tradition demands it. Clean hands mean clean rule, or so they say. It's strange, isn't it? Even something as simple as washing could become a message. Every gesture, no matter how small, carried meaning. A glance, a nod, the order in which someone was acknowledged. It could make or break alliances. Royal life was diplomacy wrapped inside performance, repeated every morning like an unending play. If the monarch's fingers trembled, a rumor began. If he smiled too long, someone whispered that he'd gone mad. If he smiled too long, someone whispered that he'd gone mad. And if he laughed during the wrong prayer, heaven help the poor soul who took it personally. You might imagine that kings loved these rituals, the robes, the trumpets, the sense of control. But the truth is quieter, more human. Most hated it. The endless bowing, the phrases repeated word for word, the kneeling courtiers who never looked you in the eye. A king's day was a carousel of formality, spinning in the same circle, endlessly polished and empty. Imagine this: the king sits for the levee, the public waking ceremony. He's not even fully dressed yet, but already the room is full. Ambassadors, nobles, advisors, even artists, all waiting for their turn to bow and speak a few memorized lines. Some offer reports, others present gifts, but all want something. Behind the polite smiles and graceful gestures, there's calculation. Who stood closer? Who spoke longer? Who caught the king's eye? These were matters of survival at court, the difference between favor and exile. To outsiders, it looked glorious. The king surrounded by shimmering silks, 100 candles reflected in the mirrors of his chamber, the floor dusted with rose petals, music drifting faintly through open doors. But to the man sitting at the center of it all, it was something else, a cage of expectation, polished daily until it blinded. He had to remember names, gestures, loyalties. He had to smile at men he did not trust. He had to mourn publicly for those he privately despised. And through it all, he had to appear serene. A king could not look tired. A king could not rub his eyes or sigh. Even fatigue was an act of treason against image. There's an account from a chronicler in the court of Charles V of France. He wrote, "Our Lord King eats as though the heavens watch." He meant it literally. Each meal was a ceremony. Every movement, the folding of a napkin, the tasting of wine, followed centuries-old rules. If the monarch broke them, it was said that the kingdom itself would fall out of balance. Before the first bite, prayers were chanted. Food tasters stepped forward. Then the herald announced the courses in a voice so loud it echoed down the entire corridor. Roast swan, honeyed pears, spiced bread, each dish presented like an offering to a living god. But gods, as we know, don't get to choose what they eat. And neither did kings. The irony is that all this pomp was meant to remind people that the king was sacred, that he was above hunger, fatigue, and desire. But it also reminded him every single day that he belonged to everyone but himself. After breakfast came the council audience. The great hall filled again, this time with ministers and generals, each ready with long speeches, carefully rehearsed, and often pointless. The king would nod, gesture, and agree where appropriate. But in truth, much of it had been decided long before he arrived. The crown gave him authority, yes, but it also chained him to protocol. Every decision required signatures, seals, witnesses, even when he wanted to act on impulse, to reward a loyal soldier or forgive a minor crime. Someone would whisper, "Your Majesty, precedent forbids it." And so he nodded again and again. Something inside him quietly withered. If you listen closely, you might hear what ceremony really sounds like. Not music or trumpets, but the rustle of silk, the low murmur of waiting voices, the scrape of shoes on marble. It's the sound of people pretending not to breathe while they watch power move. It's the heartbeat of a kingdom built on appearances. There were ceremonies for everything, for waking, for dining, for signing decrees, for walking through a garden, even for sitting. One might think that being king meant freedom, but truly, it meant never being allowed to stop performing. Some nights, after the last banquet and the last blessing, when the torches burned low and the courtiers finally vanished, the king would sit alone at the edge of his bed. His hands still smelled faintly of incense. The crown sat on its cushion nearby, glinting faintly in the candlelight, and for a few moments he could simply exist. No ceremony, no titles, just a man with sore shoulders and too many thoughts. I like to think that's when they dreamed most clearly, not of conquest or glory, but of simple things. A walk through a field, a meal without an audience, a day where silence meant peace, not suspicion. But even those moments didn't last, because morning would come again, and with it the ritual. The same words, the same bows, the same polished smiles. Kings lived inside repetition, a repetition so precise it became a kind of prison, wrapped in silk and gold. If you've ever had to smile through a conversation you didn't want to have, imagine doing it every day for a lifetime. That was ceremony. And yet, it wasn't just vanity. Ceremony kept the world in order, or at least made it look that way. When the king appeared calm, the people felt safe. When the rituals went smoothly, the courtiers believed the realm was stable. Ceremony was a kind of illusion, and like all illusions, it needed constant tending. That is an old saying from a 14th century courtier. The king's silence is louder than 1,000 drums. It meant that even the smallest gesture could carry the weight of life or death. If the king frowned, someone might lose their estate. If he smiled, fortunes could be made overnight. No one could ever be certain what he truly meant, not even he himself. So kings learned the art of restraint, to speak in riddles, to smile without warmth, to bless without promise. It was safer that way. But over years, that restraint hardened into habit. The face became a mask. The man disappeared behind it. Sometimes during a feast, when the hall shimmered with laughter and gold, a king might pause mid-bite, struck by a strange thought. All this noise, all this joy, and yet none of it felt real. Every person in the room waited for his reaction. Not because they cared what he felt, but because their own survival depended on it. In that moment, surrounded by light and music, he might feel lonelier than ever. Ceremony was meant to honor the crown, but in truth, it swallowed the person who wore it. The rituals that preserved royal dignity also consumed it, one gesture at a time. They called it majesty. He called it exhaustion. And so, when the candles burned low and the echoes of the day faded into silence, the king might whisper to the darkness, "Tomorrow, it begins again." He was right. It always did. There's a moment, just before dawn, when even a palace seems peaceful. The torches gutter out, the corridors fall silent, and the world feels almost normal. But only for a heartbeat, because in a royal palace, peace never really exists. Even in sleep, the king is never alone. Behind carved doors and silk curtains, the quiet is deceptive. Servants move like shadows, checking candles, folding robes, whispering about the next morning's schedule. Guards stand motionless outside every door, their armor gleaming faintly in torchlight. The air itself seems to hum with obedience. And at the center of it all lies the king, wrapped in linen sheets, his breathing steady. If you didn't know better, you might think him safe. But in truth, even this stillness is watched. Privacy was a luxury kings were never allowed to buy. Every moment, waking, sleeping, bathing, praying, existed under the watchful eyes of others. The body of a king was not a man's body. It was a symbol, a relic, a living monument. And monuments, of course, must always be displayed. From the first breath of morning to the last flicker of candlelight, eyes followed him. A valet would stand at the ready as he dressed. A chamberlain would kneel at his bedside, waiting for a single word of command. A taster would sip his wine before he did. A confessor would listen to the sins he dared not speak to anyone else. And even that man would report, quietly, to higher ears. There was no door he could lock, no thought he could keep entirely his own. Even his letters were opened, copied, sealed again. Even his dreams, if he spoke them aloud, became part of royal gossip. You might think the king could at least retreat to his private chambers for solitude, but that word, private, meant something very different in the medieval world. Privacy was not comfort. It was privilege, granted in tiny doses, and even then, never truly alone. In royal apartments, walls were thin. Tapestries didn't muffle sound as much as they pretended to, and every room led to another: chambers, antechambers, galleries, guard rooms, like an endless maze of presence. Someone was always nearby. The royal bedroom itself was more stage than sanctuary. It was where power slept on display. Ambassadors were sometimes invited in the morning to witness the king rise, to prove he was alive, well, and in control. Even intimacy had witnesses. The very act of getting into bed could be ceremonial, supervised by a dozen attendants. The doors would close only halfway, never fully. The message was clear. The body of the monarch belonged to the realm. Alober Twomp. It's a strange thought, isn't it? To never truly be alone, to never walk barefoot across a floor without someone noting it, recording it, judging it. To never speak freely, even to yourself. Some kings found ways to escape. They disguised themselves, sneaking into streets at night, dressed as merchants or monks. They said it was curiosity, a chance to see what the common people thought of their ruler. But perhaps deep down, they simply wanted to remember what it felt like to exist unobserved. One story tells of King Henry VIII, slipping through London's back alleys in plain clothes. He returned hours later, face flushed from the cold, grinning like a schoolboy. He told his servants he'd bought a meat pie from a street vendor, and no one had recognized him. For a brief moment he'd been nobody, and he said it felt better than any feast. His servants wrote it down, and in doing so, even that small freedom became part of the record. In a palace, secrets had no soil to grow in. Every conversation echoed, every whisper found an ear, every favor became a story retold by candlelight. The courtiers called it the river. Information flowed through it, from servants to scribes, from scribes to advisors, and finally to the king himself. But by the time it reached him, the truth had drowned somewhere along the way. He might ask, "What are the people saying?" and receive a carefully shaped answer, wrapped in flattery. No one dared tell him too much or too little. To offend the crown with honesty was as dangerous as deceiving it, and so the king's world became a hall of mirrors, each one reflecting what others wanted him to see. Even his perception of reality was curated for him. Picture a scene. The king sits by a window, the evening light turning everything gold. Outside, a garden sways gently in the wind. Roses, fountains, doves. He wants to walk there, to feel the air on his face. But before he can rise, a hand is already at the latch. A servant steps forward. "Your Majesty, shall I summon the guards?" He hesitates, a simple stroll, and already a procession forms around him. By the time he steps outside, he is surrounded, a half-circle of attendants, each with a task, each pretending to vanish while standing plainly in sight. The gardener bows, the guards lower their eyes, and still the king feels their presence pressing like an invisible wall. He reaches out to touch a rose. A voice immediately whispers, "Mind the thorns, sire." He withdraws his hand. Freedom, it seems, has been replaced by advice. Even sleep was no escape. At night, the guards remained, 2 at the door, 2 at the window, 1 pacing the corridor. A flicker of movement, a cough, a sigh, all noted. In some courts, the bed itself was checked for daggers or poison before the king lay down. In others, the sheets were sprinkled with holy water, as if God himself were needed to guard his rest. And yet, danger rarely came from the outside. It was the people closest to him who posed the greatest threat. Advisors who whispered loyalty in the morning might conspire by night. A cupbearer might be bribed. A relative might covet the crown. So even among trusted faces, the king's eyes never stopped scanning. Trust, like sleep, became a forgotten luxury. In the rare moments he was truly alone, perhaps while dressing or between audiences, he might pause and stare at his reflection in a mirror. The image staring back was familiar, yet somehow distant. Was that his face? Or the crown's? Did he even remember what his own voice sounded like when it wasn't softened for ceremony? There's something haunting in that thought. To live so long in public that you start to vanish in private. To become both idol and prisoner, trapped inside the image everyone else believes in. Letters were the closest thing to privacy many monarchs ever had, but even those were dangerous. The wrong phrase could be misread, the wrong confession copied, couriers intercepted, wax seals broken, ink smudged deliberately to claim accident. So kings learned to write in layers, hidden meanings between polite lines, affection disguised as metaphor, fear wrapped in diplomacy. Sometimes they burned their letters after writing them, not to destroy the evidence, but to protect the honesty that had finally escaped their lips. Imagine that. The one moment they spoke freely was also the moment they had to erase it. In truth, power and solitude rarely coexist. To hold power is to invite eyes, and the higher you climb, the more eyes there are. By the time you sit at the top on that cold, jeweled throne, you are seen by everyone and known by no one. The king learned to live like a shadow in his own palace, smiling when expected, silent when wise, nodding when safe. He grew cautious with words, even in prayer. He began to wonder whether God himself might be taking notes. Sometimes he escaped, not physically, but in memory. He'd recall his youth, before the crown, riding alone through wet fields, wind biting his cheeks. No procession, no guards, no titles. Just the sound of hooves in mud and the thrill of being unseen. He missed that. Not the freedom to command, but the freedom to disappear. As night deepens, the palace quiets again. Candles burn down to wax pools. The last attendants retreat to their corners. and for a few short hours the world forgets to watch. But the habit of being observed runs deep. Even in dreams, the king imagines eyes. He turns his head on the pillow and whispers, half asleep, "Are you still there?" And somewhere beyond the curtains, a guard answers softly, "Always, sire." The king sighs, not in relief but in resignation. He closes his eyes again, knowing that even in darkness, he will never truly be unseen. There's a sound that only old castles make, a low, constant hum, like stone remembering footsteps. It seeps through the corridors, settles in the cracks, and lingers long after the torches go out. It's not the wind, it's not the echo of music, it's something deeper, the murmur of history itself, whispering to whoever still listens. And in that sound, if you listen carefully, you might hear the quiet truth that every king eventually learns, that his castle, for all its beauty and glory, was never built to be a home. It was built to keep him in. To the world beyond, the royal palace stood like a dream carved from stone, high towers piercing the mist, flags snapping in the wind, courtyards blooming with fountains and sculpted gardens. From a distance it looked invincible, a fortress of power, a monument to control. But step inside those same walls, and you'd find something colder. Corridors that seemed to twist forever, windows too narrow to climb through, rooms so vast they made the human voice sound small. The walls that were meant to protect also kept the king very still. The castle was his domain, yes, but it was also his world entire, a world of limits, disguised as grandeur. He could not wander the markets. He could not visit a tavern without a disguise. Even the church, that house of God open to all, became a private chapel for royal eyes only. Everywhere else was too dangerous, too uncertain, too alive. So he stayed, and the palace became his horizon. Imagine walking through those endless hallways, each step echoing, each door opening onto another layer of silence. Servants bow as you pass, their eyes stay lowered, their movements practiced, and all the while, a strange feeling creeps in, that you are surrounded by people, and yet, completely alone. You'd think a king could order company, but companionship can't be commanded. He could fill the room with laughter, and still feel like he was talking to ghosts, because no one ever spoke to the man, only to the crown. In every castle, there was a view reserved for the ruler, a balcony overlooking the city, a high window above the courtyard, a terrace facing the horizon. He would stand there, watching smoke curl from chimneys far below, listening to the faint buzz of life, merchants haggling, children shouting, carts rolling over cobblestones. He could see it all, but he couldn't touch it. The world he ruled was visible, but unreachable, and perhaps that's the cruelest kind of prison, the one built high enough to show you everything you've lost. There's a story from an old French chronicle. A king, still young, once asked to walk through the town unguarded. Just once. His council refused. They said it was too risky, too improper, too beneath him. So he stood by the window and watched instead. He saw an old woman laughing with a baker. He saw a boy chase a dog down the street, and he said quietly, "They look freer than I will ever be." That moment never made it into the official records, but the servant who overheard it wrote it down anyway. And for that, we owe him something priceless, a glimpse of truth through the cracks of ceremony. You see, castles were not just fortresses. They were symbols of control, not just for the kingdom, but for the king himself. Every wall, every locked gate, every guard post reminded him that escape was unthinkable. He was too valuable to risk, too sacred to wander, too watched to breathe. Even the gardens were enclosed, walled off, guarded, patrolled. The birds could fly out, the king could not. Inside, time passed differently. The outside world changed. Wars began, seasons turned, generations grew and died. But inside those stone walls, everything stayed the same prayers, the same meals, the same echo of boots on marble floors. The king's footsteps wore grooves into the stone over the years, a quiet record of repetition. He would walk the same path every morning, from his chambers to the council room, from the council to the chapel, from the chapel back to the same window. If you followed those faint marks on the floor centuries later, you'd be tracing the shape of his captivity. At night, when the castle fell still, the king would sometimes wander alone, or as alone as he could be. The guards followed at a distance, their torches flickering like cautious stars. He would move through the great hall, past empty tables that once held banquets, past paintings of ancestors staring down with eyes that seemed almost alive. He'd pause by the grand doors, the ones that led to the world beyond. They were always locked, of course. 2 soldiers stood on either side. He'd nod, and they'd bow, and he'd walk away, pretending he'd only come for air. The strangest thing about power is how it shrinks the world. The more you control, the less you can touch. The more you own, the less you can hold. Every step the king took was planned. Every place he sat was chosen for him. Even the view from his chair was arranged for maximum symbolism. He could decide the fate of thousands, but not his own afternoon. There's a haunting kind of beauty in those old castles, the beauty of endurance, of silence polished smooth by time. But for the one who lived inside, it was like living inside a portrait, perfect, still, unchanging, lifeless. Sometimes he would press his hand to the cold wall, just to feel something real. The stone never answered. It only reminded him how long forever could feel. Some kings tried to fill the emptiness with sound, music, laughter, feasts, hunting parties, anything to make the castle feel alive. But once the music stopped, the echoes only made the silence heavier. You can fill a hall with people, but you can't fill loneliness with ceremony. The castle, in its stillness, always won. And so the king learned to accept it. The quiet captivity of his crown. He learned to move like a man in a museum, slowly, gracefully, careful not to disturb the relics around him. He learned that freedom was not for those who ruled. It was for those who bowed and walked away. The crown promised glory, but behind the marble and gold, it built its own kind of cage. A beautiful one, yes, but a cage all the same. Dinner was the stage upon which every kingdom performed its illusion. If the court was the mind of power, then the dining hall was its beating heart, loud, glittering, and full of secrets. The king's table was more than a place to eat. It was a battlefield, a theatre, and a confessional all at once. And though the air smelled of roasted meat and sweet wine, beneath it lingered something else, a quiet, nervous fear. Because when a king sat down to eat, everyone else held their breath. Imagine the hall first. High ceilings carved with angels and beasts, dozens of chandeliers dripping wax onto marble floors, tables stretching so far you could barely see where they ended. At the center, the royal table, raised on a dais, shimmering beneath the glow of 100 candles. The king sits there, the focal point of everything. Around him, his family, advisors, foreign guests, and a small army of attendants, every movement choreographed, every dish arriving at a perfect moment. The orchestra tunes softly in the corner. A servant announces the first course, like a herald reading a decree. To the untrained eye, it's magnificent, but to the king, it's another kind of burden, a ritual he must endure, not enjoy. Meals were never private. They were public declarations of wealth, control, and health. The people needed to see their ruler eat well, for it meant the land itself was safe. So the royal table overflowed with abundance, pheasant glazed in honey, golden loaves, trout in wine, fruits imported from distant lands, where most of his subjects would never set foot. Yet even as he lifted his fork, he was reminded that every bite was watched, not just by courtiers, but by those whose loyalty was uncertain. Food tasters sampled everything first. One mouthful of stew could change the course of history. The king knew that better than anyone. Poison, the silent guest at every feast. No sword could cut through laughter, but a drop of venom could bring down an empire. In the medieval courts of Europe, food and danger were inseparable. The most powerful men in the world lived in fear of what sat on their plates. A suspicious smell, a strange color, a cup that felt slightly warm. Each detail could set the heart racing. There are accounts of kings who refused to eat fruit from unknown orchards, who ordered their cooks to taste wine 3 times before serving, who would go hungry rather than trust a meal prepared by foreign hands. A few, ironically, met their end anyway, by honeyed desserts or gifts of rare spices. The sweeter the flavor, the deeper the suspicion. Picture the king's face during a feast. He smiles, nods, lifts his goblet, speaks in warm tones, but his eyes are busy. They flicker toward the servants, the guests, the cups. He listens to every laugh, every whisper. He watches who eats heartily, and who merely pretends to. Because the table, for all its splendor, was also a test. Loyalty could be measured in appetite, defiance in hesitation, and if you were clever, you'd make sure to chew slowly, sip lightly, and never, ever taste before your king did. There's something haunting about how carefully royal food was managed. Before each meal, entire teams of cooks worked in guarded kitchens, each one watched by soldiers. Recipes were written in code, ingredients delivered in sealed containers, and the final dish locked away until the moment of presentation. Even the plates had guards. A single careless hand could mean execution. And still, mistakes happened. In one Spanish court, a cook was accused of serving the wrong salt to the king's stew. He was hanged before the second course arrived. Later, they discovered it had been a simple kitchen error, but by then, the message had already been delivered. In a king's house, fear was seasoning enough. And yet, amid that tension, there was beauty. The hall glowed with laughter, music, and the clink of silver. Jesters told clever jokes. Minstrels sang tales of love and victory. The air filled with warmth and perfume. The king smiled when expected, and for a few moments, the burden of rule almost felt light. He could lose himself in the illusion. The laughter, the shimmering goblets, the feeling that all was well in the world. But illusion, as always, fades with the smoke. At the far end of the hall, the servants cleared the dishes, and the scent of roast and spice gave way to candle wax and tired air. The courtiers began their real work. Whispers replaced laughter. Alliances formed in the corners. Plots stirred behind polite smiles. Because a feast was never just a meal, it was politics with tablecloths. Who sat closest to the king mattered more than what was eaten. To be near him meant favor. To be too far meant danger. A misplaced seat could end a career. A raised toast could start a war. Even the way a goblet was lifted, high, slow, or hesitating, was a language everyone understood. Late into the night, when the last minstrels packed away their lutes, the king would sit back in his chair, the room dim, his crown casting long shadows on the table. He would look down at the remains of the feast, the half-eaten bread, the spilled wine, the wilted flowers, and see not abundance but waste. He would think of the fields, the peasants who had harvested, baked, and brewed for this one glittering evening, all so their ruler could eat under the watch of fear. It was supposed to be power, but it tasted strangely hollow. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk to the kitchens after everyone had gone. The cooks would bow, startled, unsure what to do. He would wave them off, and then, standing in the smoky stillness, he would take a piece of bread from the shelf, tear it with his hands, and eat in silence. No ceremony, no silver, no gold, just the sound of chewing, and the faint crackle of dying embers. Perhaps for the first time all day, he tasted something real. Meals were meant to nourish, but for kings, they became mirrors. They reflected every truth he wanted to avoid. His isolation, his fragility, his dependence on others. The table was supposed to symbolize control, but more often, it revealed how little control he truly had. And when the feast was over, when the laughter had faded and the candles had guttered out, only one sound remained. The slow ticking of the clock, marking time until the next day, the next meal, the next performance. Because for a king, even hunger had to wait its turn in line with fear. For all the stories told of kings, the power, the palaces, the wealth, few ever speak of what they feared most. Love, not the grand poetic kind sung by minstrels, but the quiet, dangerous kind that made them human. Because for a king, love was never simple. It was duty, treaty, performance, and risk. And the more power he held, the less room there was for his heart to breathe. Picture a royal wedding. 1,000 candles flickering across a cathedral floor, gold-threaded robes sweeping over stone steps, a chorus of bells and prayers echoing into the air. To the people watching, it looked like a miracle, a union blessed by heaven itself. But for the bride and groom, it was usually the first real time they'd spoken. Their vows weren't born from affection. They were written by diplomats, polished by advisors, and sealed with wax, before either of them had the courage to whisper, yes. Kings didn't marry for love, they married for borders. Every royal bed was a map, each child born was a treaty, every gesture of affection, a political statement. Behind the smiles and veils, there were negotiations. What lands would be merged, what taxes forgiven, what wars prevented by a kiss exchanged before an altar. Even the wedding night, that most private of hours, was rarely private at all. Servants waited behind curtains. Witnesses recorded the proof of consummation. It was less a beginning of intimacy than a confirmation of alliance. The act that should have belonged to two souls belonged instead to an entire kingdom. But love, like wind through a keyhole, has a way of sneaking in, even through locked doors. And though kings were told not to feel, many did. Deeply, helplessly, foolishly. There are letters still preserved in royal archives, smudged with tears, written in secret, from kings who had everything but freedom to love. A few lines in Latin or French, always careful, never too bold. But the longing drips between the words. If only the night would forget who I am, one wrote, then I could simply be a man. Infidelity was common, yes, but not always from lust. Sometimes it was from loneliness. To be adored, but not known is a kind of hunger that power cannot feed. So the king found comfort in the few who dared to see him as human. A musician, a lady in waiting, a servant, bold enough to meet his gaze. In those brief, stolen moments, he could laugh without consequence. He could whisper without fear. He could, for a heartbeat, exist as himself. But of course, the walls listened. The court always found out. And love, once discovered, became ammunition. Imagine the queen's chambers across the hall, lavish, perfumed, silent. She too had her own form of captivity. A queen's love was no freer than a king's. She was watched, weighed, and whispered about. Every glance toward a knight, every letter received, became a matter of state. If she smiled too brightly, it was scandal. If she mourned too deeply, it was suspicion. If she bore no child, it was failure. Her body became a ledger of national hope and fear. Her womb, a battlefield for dynasties. In some courts, affection was traded like currency. A single rose left on a balcony might decide the future of an empire. A dance at a feast could ruin a family. Even a rumor of love could shift the balance of power. Kings learned to use it like a weapon. They promised hearts they did not own. They swore devotion to gain loyalty. And in doing so, they forgot what real love even sounded like. There's a letter written by Henry II to his mistress, Rosamond, hidden in the margins of a prayer book, between verses about humility. It reads, in trembling script, "If I must kneel to anyone in this world, let it be to you." It's a tender thing. A man of iron, confessing weakness in the only way he could, in secret. But Rosamond, as the story goes, was later found and poisoned by the queen. And that note, it remained, folded, hidden, a ghost of feeling in a world that punished emotion. Some kings, wiser or luckier, found love in their queens, genuine companionship, growing slowly between duty and distance. They shared books, laughter, sleepless nights by the fire, and though affection could not erase responsibility, it softened it. It reminded the king that even amidst splendor and suspicion, he was still human. But such marriages were rare and fragile. Because politics never stopped at the door, even tenderness could be read as weakness. Even a lover could become a liability. When the day ended and the doors were barred, the king would sit by the window again, the moonlight slanting across his hands. He would think of all the people who adored him, and realize none of them truly knew him. To rule was to be loved in theory, and feared in person. It was to live surrounded by affection, and starved of intimacy. He could command loyalty, but not warmth. He could order obedience, but not a heartbeat. Sometimes he dreamed, not of battles or banners, but of something simpler. A quiet cottage far from court, a meal cooked without servants, a voice beside him that spoke without, "Your Majesty." He'd wake with that image, still lingering, and for a moment, he would almost smile. Then the guards would knock, the ritual would begin, and the dream would vanish like smoke in cold air. In love, as in rule, the king was never free. His heart lived behind the same locked doors as his crown. He could conquer nations, but never his own loneliness. And so he learned to keep his tenderness hidden, in letters never sent, in glances that never lingered, in the soft silence between two breaths that no one would ever record. Because in the world of kings, even love needed permission to exist. Power, for all its glitter, has a sound. It isn't the clash of swords or the roar of crowds. It's quieter, heavier, like the creak of a chair that's carried too much. That sound is the throne. Every king began by dreaming of it, the great seat of rule, carved from oak or marble, gilded in gold, placed high above all others. But the older they grew, the more they understood that the throne wasn't just furniture. It was a burden carved into shape, and once you sat upon it, you couldn't stand up again. Not truly. Because ruling wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. Picture the throne room, a chamber vast enough to make even a whisper sound holy, the air thick with incense, banners hanging motionless from the ceiling. At the far end, that single chair, a symbol of divine authority. It looks magnificent. Yes, but look closer. The seat is narrow, uncomfortable, the back straight and unforgiving, a design made not for rest, but for posture, to remind the ruler that ease was not part of his destiny. The moment the king sat, ceremony began. Every eye turned to him. Every breath in the room waited for his next movement. One nod could raise a man to wealth. One frown could destroy him. And the weight of all that expectation settled, invisible but relentless, on the king's shoulders. No one told him how heavy the throne would feel, the crown already pressed into his skull, the robes dragged at his neck. Now the silence pressed too. When you sit high enough to see everyone, you stop being seen yourself. He could look across that hall, at his ministers, his guards, his family, and realize that each one wanted something different from him. Guidance, mercy, money, glory. They all pulled at him in invisible ways, and he had to hold them together like a bridge made of human will. A single crack, and everything fell. In those councils that stretched on for hours, when parchment rustled and quills scratched like gnats, the king often found his thoughts drifting. He would stare at the wax pooling beside a candle and think of the world outside, a farmer digging in the cold earth, a fisherman pulling nets through mist, people who would never know his name, but whose lives depended on the turn of his pen. What if he was wrong? What if the law he just signed ruined more lives than it saved? The court would say, God guides the crown. But even faith didn't always silence the doubt that crept in at night. Power wasn't certainty. It was responsibility wearing armor. You might imagine kings as men of absolute confidence, but many spent nights pacing alone, rehearsing speeches to no one, or praying in whispers that cracked mid-sentence. Every decision carved a scar somewhere, on a village, on a soldier, on a family. A king was expected to be steady, decisive, unshakable, but beneath the robes and oaths, most were simply afraid of failing their own story. One chronicler wrote of a ruler who kept 2 chairs in his chamber, the throne for the world to see, and a simple wooden stool for when he needed to remember he was still mortal. Sometimes he'd swap them in the middle of the night, as if humility could balance the crown for a few quiet minutes. There's a strange kind of fatigue that power brings, not the exhaustion of the body, but of the soul. The endless cycle of decisions, faces, ceremonies, lies. The king became a vessel for everything his people wanted him to be: strong, wise, immortal. But inside, he was breaking like anyone else. Imagine the weight of knowing that every war begun or ended would be blamed on you, that every famine, flood, or fire was somehow divine punishment for your sins. The weather itself became your moral report card. A bad harvest meant the king had angered God. A storm meant his heart was corrupt. Even the sky turned against him if the people needed someone to blame. When the burdens grew too loud, some kings sought counsel, priests, philosophers, friends. Others turned to wine, or solitude, or silence. A few simply stopped deciding altogether, letting their ministers rule while they sat frozen, eyes open, soul somewhere far away. History remembers them as weak, but maybe they were simply tired. Tired of being responsible for the suffering of others. Tired of pretending that power brought peace. Because the truth is, the higher the throne, the thinner the air. You can almost picture one of them, an aging monarch, sitting long after everyone's gone. The torches hiss, the banners hang still. His hand trembles slightly on the armrest. In front of him, the great doors stand closed. He could walk through them. He could step down, disappear into the dark, and never look back. But he doesn't. He can't. The throne has shaped him too long. He's no longer sure where it ends, and he begins. And that's the quiet tragedy of kingship. that the man becomes part of the furniture. Sometimes a servant would find him asleep there, head resting against his arm, crown tilted, the great seal still clutched in one weary hand. They would wake him gently, and he would straighten his robes, as if the brief collapse had never happened. Then he'd smile the practiced smile, the one that reassured a nation, and say, "Let us continue." And so, the throne would creak again, accepting the weight of another day. There's an old saying from a Renaissance courtier: every king dies standing. It didn't mean heroism, it meant exhaustion, that kings rarely got to rest before death claimed them mid-duty. Even in their final hours, scribes stood by the bedside, ready to record the royal last words. Doctors argued, priests prayed, courtiers wept strategically, and somewhere beneath it all, the dying king might have whispered something simple, something human, that never made it into the record. Maybe he just said, "I'm tired." That would have been enough. The weight of the throne was never lifted. It was merely passed along. Each new ruler inherited not just a crown, but centuries of ghosts. Decisions made, lives lost, promises broken, and the throne, patient as stone, waited for the next body to hold its shape. So when you see a portrait of a king, the gold, the jewels, the steady gaze, remember what the painter didn't show: the ache beneath the armor, the silence behind the smile, and the invisible heaviness pressing down, long after the crowd had gone. Because power may raise a man to heaven, but it also teaches him how heavy heaven can be. If the throne was heavy, the court was sharp. It glittered with gold. But every jewel had an edge. To walk through those marble corridors was to move through a garden of daggers, hidden, perfumed, and smiling. The king knew this better than anyone. His enemies didn't always wear armor. Sometimes they wore silk. The royal court was supposed to be a place of loyalty, the beating heart of the kingdom, where wisdom gathered and loyalty was rewarded. But in truth, it was something else entirely. A theater of ambition, a chessboard with human pieces. And the king, despite his crown, was never entirely sure who was really playing the game. Every noble had a secret. Every servant heard more than they admitted. Every smile was a calculation. And yet, the court functioned, beautifully, elegantly, as if choreographed by fate. That's what made it so dangerous. Picture the scene. A long gallery filled with the shimmer of silk and the scent of incense. Courtiers glide across the floor like ghosts, whispering behind fans and goblets. The sound of laughter floats in the air, soft, practiced, and slightly too polished to be real. The king enters, and a wave of motion ripples outward. Every head bows, every conversation freezes mid-sentence. He smiles, they smile back, but even as he moves among them, he feels the tension in the air, that fine, invisible thread that keeps power taut, ready to snap. Somewhere in this crowd, someone wishes him dead. He doesn't know who, but he can feel it, like a chill beneath the music. Kings learned early that enemies could be made from silence as easily as from insult. Ignore a lord too long, and he might turn to rebellion. Favor one family too much, and another would plot revenge. Every gift was a potential betrayal. Every kindness, a new debt. Even truth, when spoken too plainly, became dangerous. So the king learned to speak in riddles, to nod at lies and pretend they were wisdom, to smile when someone praised him too perfectly, because no praise ever came without a hidden hook. It wasn't all deception, of course. There was beauty in the court, music drifting down candlelit halls, artists unveiling masterpieces, philosophers debating under frescoed ceilings. But even beauty had ambition behind it. A painter didn't want to capture the king's soul, he wanted a lifetime pension. A poet didn't seek truth, he sought favor. Even faith, at times, became a performance for promotion. The court sparkled like sunlight on water, but if you looked too long, it could drown you. There's a story from the court of Philip IV of Spain. One night, during a grand masquerade ball, a nobleman approached the king, dressed as a jester. He bowed low and said, "Your Majesty, I come as truth." The hall went silent. Everyone watched. The king smiled faintly and replied, "Then you've come, in the only disguise that will save you." The laughter returned, brittle, nervous, but no one ever saw that nobleman at court again. That was how power worked here, not through shouting, but through silence that lasted too long. The most dangerous thing in any court wasn't open rebellion. It was subtlety, the slow poisoning of trust, the tiny, invisible gestures that changed everything, a whisper to the wrong ear, a misplaced letter, a rumor that began with, "They say His Majesty is not himself lately." By the time it reached the king, it had already become gospel. He might deny it, laugh it off, command silence, but the damage was done. Doubt, once sown, never truly died. It grew roots in the corridors and crept beneath the tapestries. You could smell it sometimes, a faint bitterness, like smoke before a fire. The courtiers were masters of survival. They learned to move without leaving footprints, to flatter without seeming false, to betray without being blamed. They bowed low and rose higher, and all the while they watched one another with the same quiet terror the king felt every day. For they too were prisoners of performance. A single misstep, a wrong word, a laugh at the wrong time could cost them everything. The court smiled by day, but wept in private. Its beauty was built on exhaustion. Sometimes, a noble would fall from favor. Suddenly, inexplicably, the king would summon him, speak a few gentle words, and within a day, his lands would be confiscated, his name erased. No one asked why, no one dared. At supper, his seat would remain empty. The others would glance at it, once, just once, then continue eating, as if he had never existed. That was how power protected itself. Not with force, but with forgetfulness. To disappear from memory was the most terrifying punishment of all. The irony, of course, was that the king himself was never immune to the same machinery he commanded. The courtiers whispered about him, too. They measured his mood like astronomers tracking the stars. Was he drinking more? Was he praying less? Had he looked too long at that ambassador's wife? Every gesture became prophecy. Every sigh became omen. And so, even in his own palace, the king learned to perform for the watchers he could not trust. But sometimes, amid all the danger, he found strange comfort in it. At least the lies were predictable. At least deceit had rules. Truth, when it appeared, was the real threat, because it forced him to feel. So he learned to love the game a little, the same way a prisoner learns to count the steps between his cell and the courtyard. Each intrigue kept him alive, alert, awake. Without it, he might have faced himself. And that, perhaps, was the one thing more frightening than betrayal. There's a letter from a Venetian ambassador visiting the French court in the 16th century. He wrote, "Every man smiles here, but every man bleeds somewhere unseen." He wasn't being poetic, just observant. The court glittered, yes, but beneath the jewels lay bruises. People lived and died by rumors. And the king, the supposed master of them all, was trapped in the same web as everyone else. He pulled the strings, but he could never leave the stage. By night, when the corridors finally emptied, the king would walk alone through the gallery of portraits. The painted eyes of his ancestors followed him, stern, judging, immortal. Each of them had faced the same treachery, the same isolation, and each of them had survived, or not. He would stop, sometimes before one particular painting, a great-grandfather, known for cruelty, a man who trusted no one and died in his sleep, with a dagger in hand. The king would study that face in the dim light and whisper, almost kindly, "I understand you now." The next morning, he would return to the court, smiling as if nothing had changed. The courtiers would bow, and the game would begin again. The same laughter, the same flattery, the same silent duels fought with glances and words. The king would nod, speak softly, and pretend not to see the knives hidden beneath the silk, because that was what survival required, to rule among enemies who smiled, and to smile right back. There's a particular kind of silence that lives in a king's bedchamber, not the comforting hush of a quiet night, nor the sleepy calm of distant bells. This silence is thicker. It presses on the ears, as though the walls themselves are listening. It's the sound of power. After the crowds have gone, the torches have burned low. The last servant has retreated backward through the door, head bowed, leaving the king alone. And at last, at long, aching last, he has the thing he never truly wanted, but always sought, solitude. Yet he finds no peace in it, because even here, in the dim light, with the crown resting on its cushion beside him, His mind refuses to rest. Power, it seems, doesn't sleep. It starts as a flicker, a stray thought, a memory of something said earlier in the day, a word that sounded harmless, but could have meant something else, a glance exchanged across the hall that lasted just a heartbeat too long. He replays them endlessly, like beads between trembling fingers. The court has gone home, the kingdom has gone to bed, but his thoughts march on, an army without mercy. He's learned to recognize the rhythm of it, the restless spinning of doubt, the need to know, to control, to foresee every outcome before it arrives, because power has no patience for surprise. And so, long after midnight, the candles still burn, the ink still flows, and the king still thinks of enemies, of heirs, of the strange fragility of thrones. Every crown comes with a shadow, a faint outline of everything that could go wrong. The king feels it constantly, hovering just over his shoulder. He's learned to speak kindly to it, to make peace with the thought that everything he's built could vanish overnight. A sickness, a rebellion, a betrayal from within his own blood. The crown balances on chaos, and he alone is expected to keep it steady. Imagine trying to sleep with that knowledge. Imagine waking every morning and wondering whether the hands that dress you might one day close around your throat. That's what it meant to wear the restless crown, even during moments of joy, a festival, a child's laughter, a rare moment of ease. The king feels the hum of anxiety beneath it all. It never goes away. It's the same hum that runs through every fortress, every courtroom, every royal chapel, a vibration born of duty, fear, and the knowledge that power is never permanent. No matter how high the walls, no matter how loyal the soldiers, no matter how loud the anthem, somewhere out there, someone dreams of replacing him. And that knowledge seeps into everything. It curls around his meals, his sleep, his prayers. It is the quiet, constant heartbeat of kingship, the awareness that you are both idol and target. Once, in the middle of a long winter, the king awoke suddenly in the dark, his breath cold in the air, his heart pounding like a drum. He didn't know why. No noise had stirred him, no voice had called his name, but something inside, that ancient instinct that never quite dies in rulers, told him that something was wrong. He rose, wrapped his robe around himself, and crossed the floor. The guards outside the door stood silent, motionless. The castle slept. And yet, as he looked through the window, he thought he saw movement in the courtyard below, a flicker of light, then darkness again. He stood there for a long time, staring into the void, listening to the creak of the old stones beneath his feet. Eventually, he realized it hadn't been danger at all. It was just the moon shifting behind clouds. But his pulse didn't slow, because the real fear never came from outside. It came from within. Every decision the king made fed that fear, because no choice was ever clean. To protect one part of the realm meant neglecting another. To favor one ally meant offending the rest. To pardon one traitor meant tempting 10 more. And the people, they cheered when he triumphed, and cursed when he failed. But none of them understood how close he always stood to collapse. It wasn't tyranny that made kings cruel. It was exhaustion. You can only balance so many lives on the edge of your conscience before something inside you begins to bend. Some nights, the king would open old ledgers, lists of taxes, decrees, punishments. He'd run his finger down the names. Merchants, soldiers, thieves, people he'd never met, whose lives had changed because of a signature he barely remembered writing. He wondered what they'd think of him if they could see him now, a man sitting in the dark, haunted by the echo of his own decisions. Would they pity him? Would they still bow? Or would they see the truth? That power isn't majesty at all, but a kind of endless worry in gold wrapping. Even dreams were never safe. In sleep, the king's mind turned against him. The throne became a cliff, the crown a weight, dragging him into deep water. He'd wake gasping, his fingers clawing at the sheets, the taste of iron in his mouth, and for a moment, he would forget where he was. Then the guards would stir, the candles would flare, and the illusion of control would return. But that moment, that glimpse of helplessness, was the truest thing he ever felt. In the morning, he'd rise before dawn and walk to the balcony. The city below still slept, its rooftops blue with mist, its chimneys breathing faint curls of smoke. The silence was almost kind. It reminded him that the world existed beyond his worry. And yet, even as he watched the first light spill over the horizon, his mind began to turn again. The meeting with his council, the letter from the northern provinces, the bishop's complaint, the ambassadors waiting for his answer, 1,000 little waits, settling back into place. He took a breath, slow, deliberate, then another. Then he whispered, "Begin," and the day obeyed. The courtiers sometimes called him calm, but it wasn't calm they saw. It was control, a kind of stillness, earned through fear of breaking. He had learned the art of composure, the way a soldier learns to keep breathing in battle. A king who panicked lost more than dignity. He lost the illusion that kept his world together. So he smiled, he nodded, he signed the decrees with steady hands, and inside, his thoughts ran wild like wolves behind locked gates. Power can drive a man to madness slowly, politely, the way water wears down stone. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It reminds him, again and again, that everything depends on him, and that he cannot falter, ever. The crown doesn't sleep, it doesn't forgive, it doesn't care that the man beneath it is tired or sick or lonely. It just demands to be carried, and so he carries it, through fever, through heartbreak, through doubt. He carries it because to set it down would mean admitting that he never really ruled it at all. The restless crown doesn't just weigh on the head, it seeps into the mind. It changes the way a king thinks, the way he trusts, the way he dreams. At first, it teaches discipline, then suspicion, then paranoia. He begins to measure loyalty in silence, friendship in usefulness, and peace in absence of noise. He forgets what it means to rest, because every pause feels like danger. There's a letter from the 15th century, written by a dying monarch to his heir. It begins like any other: instructions, advice, warnings. But in the final paragraph, the old king writes something few would expect. Do not let the crown think for you. It has its own voice, and it lies. He knew what many before him had learned too late. That power speaks softly, but it never speaks truthfully. It tells you that you are chosen, that you are right, that you are necessary. And once you believe that voice, you are no longer the master, you are the instrument. The restless crown, then, is not an object. It's a state of mind, a fever of purpose that never cools. You wear it long enough, and you start to see enemies where there are none, and omens in every shadow. You start to think that peace is only what happens between problems. You forget what quiet truly sounds like. Even when it's set aside at night, on its velvet pillow, it hums, it waits. It reminds you that your freedom ended the day you accepted its weight. And yet, strangely, terribly, there's love in that burden. A kind of addiction to duty, to mattering, to being the center of the storm. The king knows he cannot stop. He wouldn't know how to live without the noise, without the constant pulse of decision and consequence. The restlessness has become part of him now, second heartbeat beneath his own. If you took the crown away, if you stripped the titles and the robes and the prayers, he would still feel it. That invisible circle pressing down, that endless whisper, you must act, you must lead, you must endure. And he would obey, because that's what kings do, even when the crown is gone. By the time dawn comes again, and the bells ring for morning prayer, the king hasn't slept. He stands at the window, the light pale and cold on his face. Below, the courtyard begins to stir. Horses, servants, life returning. He watches them quietly, eyes heavy, the ghost of his crown reflected faintly in the glass. And in that reflection, he sees himself not as ruler, but as prisoner. The day will demand everything from him again. His time, his judgment, his smile. He will give it. He always does. But somewhere deep inside, where even he cannot reach, a small voice whispers, when will it end? He doesn't answer. He simply adjusts his robe, straightens his back, and walks toward the waiting throne. Because the crown, restless, patient, eternal, never truly leaves him. It only changes shape. There comes a moment in every kingdom when reverence begins to fade. It doesn't happen all at once. not in riots, not in rebellion, not even in the swing of a sword. It begins quietly, like dust collecting on a statue that no one bothers to polish anymore. The people still bow, still cheer when the king rides past, still hang his portrait above the hearth. But behind their smiles, something has changed. They have begun to see the man beneath the crown, and once a king is seen as a man, he is no longer sacred. That's how reverence dies, not in fire, but in familiarity. The medieval world was built on awe. Kings ruled not merely by might, but by mystery. They were believed to be chosen, the bridge between heaven and earth. To question them was to question God. And yet, the divine right that once kept crowns safe began to crack under the weight of time. The first cracks came with hunger. When the people's bellies grow empty, holiness loses its flavour. 1,000 sermons could not fill a loaf of bread, and so the peasants began to murmur. Why does God's chosen starve his flock? Then came the wars. Endless, bloody, expensive. Men bled for borders they would never see, while their sons grew up without fathers, their wives without food. At first they fought willingly, believing glory would wash their pain away. But as the years dragged on, and the coffins multiplied, glory began to rot in the mouth. It was then that the people started to look at their king differently. Not as a god, but as a man who could be wrong. Inside the palace, the shift was felt before it was seen. Advisors began to disagree more openly. Courtiers whispered with less caution. Priests prayed with a touch of uncertainty in their voice. Even the servants, once silent as ghosts, began to exchange glances when the king walked by. Tiny, fleeting things, but enough to chill the air. The king noticed, of course. He noticed everything. He felt the change like temperature in a room, subtle at first, then undeniable. It was in the tone of greetings, the hesitation before obedience. Reverence was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time he realized it could not be commanded back. There's an old story told of a monarch who once held court in a city plagued by famine. The people, desperate and hungry, gathered outside the palace gates, crying for bread. The king, believing they came to bless him, appeared on the balcony to wave. They fell silent. For a moment he thought it was respect, until someone threw a crust of mouldy bread at his feet. That was the beginning of the end, not of his reign that came later, but of the illusion that kept it standing. A single gesture had pierced centuries of myth. The king was no longer divine. He was visible, human, vulnerable. In earlier days, reverence had been a shield. It protected the crown from scrutiny. If a river flooded, it was God's will. If taxes rose, it was divine justice. No one dared to blame the king. But as time passed, the world changed. Knowledge crept in through the cracks. Merchants brought back books, ideas, whispers from lands where kings were less gods than governors. Philosophers began to ask questions in candlelit rooms. What if a king serves the people, not the other way around? What if reason, not blood, grants the right to rule? At first, these were just words, floating harmlessly through smoky taverns and monasteries. But words have a way of gathering power. They spread faster than armies, and once they took root in the minds of men, no crown could uproot them. The king heard those murmurs long before they reached the palace gates. Advisors assured him they were nonsense, idle talk of scholars, children of ink and parchment, not of swords and steel. But deep down he knew better. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The age of unquestioned reverence was ending, and something new, something dangerous was waking. He saw it in the eyes of young nobles, clever and restless, who spoke of modernity and justice, as though they were spells that could remake the world. He saw it in the markets, where merchants grew richer than lords, and in the cities, where crowds gathered, not for blessings, but for debate. It was as if the kingdom itself had begun to think, and thought, once born, cannot be ruled. Even religion, the eternal ally of royalty, began to drift away. The church had once declared that kings ruled by God's grace, but as corruption spread among bishops and priests, faith in divine authority weakened. If the church could sin, then so could the crown. The people began to see heaven differently, not as a pyramid, with kings near the top, but as a circle where every soul stood equal before God. It was a radical thought, and yet so simple, so irresistibly human, that it spread like fire through dry grass, and with it came a quiet revolution, not of swords, but of hearts. The king tried to hold on to reverence the only way he knew how, through spectacle. He ordered grander ceremonies, brighter processions, more gold, more music, more prayer. If the people were losing faith, perhaps beauty could buy it back. So the streets filled with banners, the bells rang for hours, and the treasury bled itself dry on jewels and feasts. But the people no longer watched with awe, they watched with weariness. They had seen too much hunger, too much war, too much truth. The parade went on, but the magic was gone. Even the king felt it, the hollow echo in every cheer, the polite applause that stopped too soon. In the castle, he began to avoid mirrors. They told him things the courtiers wouldn't, the lines around his eyes, the sag of his mouth, the way his robes, though still perfect, seemed to hang a little heavier each year. The portraits painted of him were no better. The artists, once desperate to flatter, now painted something truer, whether by accident or exhaustion. The divine glow around the crown dimmed. The eyes that once commanded now seemed to question. One painter even left a faint tremor in the king's hand, a small rebellion disguised as realism. When the king saw it, he said nothing, but that night he had the painting locked away, not destroyed, just hidden, because part of him knew that the artist had not been wrong. The fall of reverence was not a single moment. It was a slow fading, like the way candlelight softens before it goes out. Each new generation bowed a little lower, but believed a little less. The courtiers still flattered, the priests still prayed, but belief had turned into habit, and habit into ritual without soul. The king could feel it everywhere, in the brittle laughter at court, in the empty eyes of his guards, in the letters that began with Your Majesty, but carried a tone of impatience underneath. He was still obeyed, but no longer adored, still served, but no longer loved. And that difference, that small, terrible difference, was what kept him awake at night. It is strange how power can survive long after reverence dies. The laws still held, the soldiers still marched, the coins still bore his face. But it all felt hollow, like a play performed long after the audience had gone home. He found himself wondering what it had all been for. The endless decisions, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices made in the name of order and glory. He had given everything. And in return, the world had stopped believing in him. And yet, he couldn't entirely blame them, for somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing in himself too. One evening, as the sun fell behind the towers, he wandered alone through the old chapel. The stained glass, cracked and faded, still threw colours across the floor, soft blues and reds dancing like ghosts. He knelt, more out of habit than faith, and for the first time in years, he spoke not as a king, but as a man. "Have I done well?" he whispered. No answer came, only the faint creak of the rafters and the flutter of dust in a shaft of light. For the first time, he realized he no longer knew whether heaven was listening, and that, more than rebellion, more than betrayal, was the true end of reverence. Not that others stopped believing in you, but that you stopped believing in the purpose of your own crown. Outside, the city was changing. Merchants built houses taller than towers. Philosophers printed pamphlets that spread faster than royal decrees. Children grew up, knowing more of the world than their fathers ever had, and the king, still seated on his ancient throne, seemed suddenly out of place, a figure from another age, carved in the wrong century. The people didn't hate him. They simply stopped needing him, and for a ruler, that's worse than hatred, because hatred still gives you shape. Indifference erases you entirely. One night, when the bells struck midnight, the king walked to the balcony, overlooking the city. Below, the streets glowed with lanterns and noise, the laughter of commoners, the music of taverns, the heartbeat of life, moving on without him. He stood there, crownless, robe loose around his shoulders, watching the world he no longer ruled. A soft breeze carried the smell of bread, of smoke, of earth, ordinary scents he hadn't truly noticed in years, and for the first time he understood the people were never his to control. They had always belonged to themselves. He had been their symbol, their story, their mirror, but mirrors, once cracked, cannot command reflection. The fall of reverence didn't end the world, it simply changed it. The kingdom went on, new rulers, new faiths, new dreams, but something old and sacred had vanished forever. The belief that one man could embody the divine. And yet, even in that loss, there was a strange kind of grace, because perhaps, at last, the king could be something he had never been before. Not a god, not a ruler, but human. He looked at his hands, calloused, trembling slightly, and felt something he hadn't in years. Relief, not joy, not pride, just relief that the endless worship had ended, and that maybe, just maybe, he could rest in the knowledge that he was only mortal. That night, as he lay in bed, he did not summon the servants to undress him. He took off the heavy robe himself, folded it carefully, and placed it on the chair by the window. He touched the crown once, lightly, then left it where it was. For once, he didn't feel its pull. Outside, the wind sighed through the garden. The world was still turning, and he, at last, was still enough to hear it. Majesty looks solid from a distance. It glows in paintings, stands firm in statues, gleams in gold leaf, across ceilings. No hand will ever touch again, but step close, closer than the court ever dared, and you discover something unnerving. Majesty is not a substance. It's a space, a shape of expectation that a human being is poured into until he takes its outline and forgets the softness underneath. What is left, after years of posing inside that outline, is a hollow, not emptiness. Exactly. More like an echoing chamber where a person once spoke in his own voice. The words still come, the decrees still flow, the ceremonies still rise and fall like tides. But inside, the sound rings thin. The king hears it and knows the world is still listening. Yet he is no longer truly speaking. The hollowing does not arrive with a crash. It accumulates. A gentle, patient erosion. A smile held slightly too long. A kindness withheld because precedent forbids it. Another night of signing names that are not his, on letters he did not choose to write, toward outcomes he no longer quite believes in. No one moment breaks him. Instead, 10,000 polished gestures wear grooves into his spirit until the water of habit runs there forever. He wakes to the same ceiling, receives the same bows, tastes the same spice on the same meat, and knows precisely where fear will rise in his chest during council. At the word grain, at the phrase northern border, at the mention of air, the predictability comforts the court. It withers him. Hollowness, in a king, is often mistaken for dignity. The courtiers admire how little he flinches, how smoothly he folds sorrow into silence, how his eyes do not move when an ambassador insults him by way of compliment. They call it majesty. They whisper, with awe, that a true sovereign is marble. What they are seeing, though they do not know it, is absence, a careful subtraction of the self, until only the role remains. It is a useful illusion. A trembling hand can steady an army if the wrist is wrapped in velvet, but the hand still trembles. He begins to distrust delight. Joy, spontaneous and unscripted, is dangerous in a life patrolled by ritual. Laughter can land on the wrong ear. Pleasure can be priced by those who supply it. So he practices smaller joys. The scent of cedar in a newly sanded writing box, the slight warmth of a window pane at noon, the obedient curl of blue smoke from a candle he has personally snuffed. Little private proofs that the world can still be touched without witnesses. Each one is genuine. Each one is brief. Soon, even these require management. Someone notices that the king pauses at that window. The curtains are adjusted henceforth, the ledge polished, a cushion installed. Comfort arrives, escorted by attention, and shrivels beneath it. Melancholy makes a home in the corridors. At first it is a visiting companion, lingering after guests depart, pacing when the castle sleeps. Then it learns the passages by heart. It knows which stair squeaks, which flagstone cools the feet in summer. It sits in the second chair by the fire and nods while the king reads documents he hates. It does not offer arguments. It offers presence, a quiet hand on the shoulder that says, "I will be here when the triumph is finished," and when it isn't, he does not fight it. Not exactly. He carries it the way he carries the scepter, as one more necessary weight. Those who write the chronicles will say nothing of this. They will note victories, treaties, baptisms, the number of swans roasted at the Jubilee. Their ink will be exact about the time the royal procession reached the West Gate and the shade of red ordered for the herald's sleeves. They will not write, "Our sovereign ate alone at noon and stared at the knife, as if it might answer a question." They will not write, "He smiled at the jester, because the jester's clatter drowned a thought he feared." They will not write, "It is difficult to be a person when an entire nation requires a symbol." History prefers conclusions to conditions. Melancholy is a condition. It leaves no seal. The physicians have words for the hollowing. They examine the king with polite hands and diagnose imbalance. Too much black bile, perhaps, or humid vapors clinging to the brain. They prescribe saffron in wine, a simple walk, a slightly later hour of rising. They suggest a change in music, more daylight in the council chamber, fewer cypress trees in view. They do not see that the ailment is architectural. It grows from walls and titles, not from humours. Still, he tries the treatment. He holds a cup infused with something golden and watches it reflect the windows, the guards, the same unwavering posture of the same advisor he has known since boyhood. He drinks. The gold goes down warm. The room does not change. He turns in time to prayer, not the ceremony of prayer, that flowing Latin that knits court and altar into one garment, but a quieter address, nearly a whisper. He keeps it short, not because God is busy, but because words are expensive, where sincerity is rare. Sometimes he says only, "Look," and waits beside the silence to see if something will be done with what he has offered. Sometimes he says nothing at all and lets the kneeling itself speak. On rare mornings, peace comes like an umbrella of shade carried across the mine. It lasts until the door opens and the first petition is announced. Advice multiplies around a hollow king. It senses the empty chambers and rushes to occupy them. One minister urges clemency, another insists on severity. A third reduces both to columns of numbers. A fourth smiles, as if no decision could possibly be wrong so long as it is prompt. He nods, grateful for their certainty, frightened by it. They cannot feel the ghostly hand of consequence that taps his ribs while he listens. They do not dream the faces of strangers at night, and wake already apologizing to people whose names he will never learn. There is a particular loneliness in being the only one who will bear a choice after the applause. The senses sharpen as the self thins. He identifies which boots belong to which guard by the pattern of wear in the heel. He knows which scribe will cough during long readouts. He can tell, from the first syllable of an envoy's greeting, how much trouble the message will bring. Acuteness is not the same as presence, but it passes for it. When people say, "Our sovereign sees all," this is what they mean. He has become a tuning fork for threats and expectations. He rings at the precise pitch of danger. Music, once a sweetness that made the walls recede, becomes measurement too. Minor keys arrive with the tax harvests. Dances speed up as the border quiets. Drums thicken when rumor suggests revolt. Even melody obeys governance in the end. Sometimes he thinks of work as a granary. Every day he adds grain, signatures, murmurs, nods, and every night the rats come and take what they please. In the morning he finds the bins lighter, the floor stippled, the smell familiar. He does not rage. It is not the rats' fault that they live here. It is not his fault that he must feed them to feed the town. Responsibility is a circle, walked until the path becomes a groove. Step by step by step. Less sky each year, more certainty in where the foot will fall. The arts try to save him. A painter demands long hours of stillness, and with an intimacy no courtier would dare, studies the fatigue in his mouth. The result astonishes the palace, not for its flattery, which is minor, but for its honesty, which is new. A musician composes a piece that begins like snow and ends like an unlocked door. The king listens, eyes closed, and forgets his name for 8 careful minutes. A mason repairs a crack in the chapel arch and leaves a mark like a smile where stone meets stone. He runs a thumb along it whenever he passes and is surprised each time by relief. These salvations are small. They are sufficient for a day. The body, loyal servant of every throne until it isn't, begins to collect tremors. A hand that never shook now wavers when sealing treaties. A knee mutinies on staircases, long mastered. Sleep throws ropes and pulls him bodily into whirlpools that mimic drowning. Waking requires 2 breaths and the memory of his title. He hides these rebellions as long as he can, not from pride but from stewardship. A realm should not inherit anxiety from the joints of a single man. Still, the court notices. They praise his gravitas, which is to say they hear the drag when he rises. He speaks more softly now, not as a tactic, not as feint, but because loudness would betray him. The muscles that made thunder are tired. Also, he has learned the economy of whispers. If you speak gently at a table of people trained to watch your lips, the room leans toward you. Leaning is as good as loyalty for the length of a sentence. Besides, the walls are always listening. It's proper to show them courtesy. He inventories the shapes of his solitude. There is the solitude of being revered, which is like standing beneath a bell no one dares ring. There is the solitude of being feared, which is like eating with a knife that has opinions. There is the solitude of being needed, which is a long hallway with doors that open as you approach and close as you pass. And there is the thin, rare solitude of being unseen, walking a roofline at dawn with a cloak and no escort, while the cooks argue about flour below. That last one he keeps like a coin in a hidden pocket. He turns it with his thumb when counsel drones. He has begun to misplace words. Titles come readily. Names of rivers do not. Latin prayers unspool without effort. The name of a village burned 2 summers ago catches on the teeth. When this happens in public, he redirects the sentence, a hawk banking into different wind. When it happens in private, he lets the blankness stand, a square of unpainted plaster where a fresco will not be finished. The mind is a cloister with doors locked to protect the library. He has misplaced the key, and is embarrassed to admit that he himself ordered it hidden. What does a king do with tenderness when it survives after everything else? He cannot spend it in the market, like common men, on small favors and laughter with strangers. He cannot lavish it on his children unobserved. Too many pens wait. Whenever his arms open, he leaves it, then in corners, a coin under a candlestick in the chapel, a bolt of good cloth, diverted to a midwife, near the south gate, spared veldt for deer, where a minister wanted timber. He tells himself, these are policies, and writes them into law with the proper language. He knows what they are. They are proofs that some chambers are not hollow yet. The court has grown expert at interpreting his silences. Some are read as assent, some as warning, some as a fog, in which advisors claim to have seen the very signal they already wanted. This is inevitable. A hollow space invites occupation. But sometimes he keeps a silence against interpretation, a stillness so complete that even the boldest lord cannot tell whether he will commend or dismantle them. He deploys this, not for strategy but for privacy. The moment belongs only to him. He watches it pass, whole and untouched, and then lets the world resume. On certain evenings the past arrives not as memory, but as furniture moved back into the room. He feels again the nonsense courage of youth, the hush before his first decree, the particular daylight that fell on his father's ring, the day it became his. He does not distrust these visits, though he does not make them guests. They stay as long as they wish, instruct him without speeches, and leave when the first petition knocks. He gives them no crown to carry as they go. The crown is here, patient on its cushion, and will not travel. Guilt is a scholar of small details. It remembers the tilt of a widow's head at an audience 7 winters gone. It remembers dust on a soldier's boots, and wonders whether the roads were bad that year, because of a bridge he did not repair when asked. It remembers a boy coughing during a procession, where he smiled, and did not stop the horses to ask why. It refuses to distinguish between failures of knowledge and failures of love. He tries to argue with it using statutes and maps. Guilt smiles, closes the book, and asks if he slept last night. He does not answer. He is not cruel. Cruelty would at least confirm a shape. He is careful to the point of ache. When punishment is necessary, he wishes to spare the hands that carry it out, but this is impossible, and he knows it. So he does the next gentle thing, and spares their names from record. The chroniclers think this is severity. It is mercy, oblique, embarrassed, imprecise, the only kind a sovereign can manage without turning compassion into spectacle. Night finds him with a ledger open and no numbers on the page. The candle throws a wavering ellipse. Wax ladders down the side like a small disaster conducted politely. He listens to the castle breathe, the compact of stone and air negotiated over centuries. It is a good sound, a true sound. Inside it, the titles fall away one by one, like cloaks taken from a tired traveller. For a few heartbeats, he is only a man who has done his best in a shape that does not fit any man for long. He does not forgive himself. Exactly. He sets down the pen and allows the possibility of decency. There are, even now, moments of astonishment. A child in the corridor curtsies too low and looks up with unfeigned wonder. He feels the crown steady itself for 1 second on that gaze. A veteran grips his forearm at a review and forgets to let go. The heat of honest regard travels the arm like medicine. Rain begins on the far edge of the courtyard, crosses the stones, and climbs the opposite wall, while every leaf vibrates in gratitude. No blessing in the chapel feels truer. He says, "Thank you" to the rain under his breath. He suspects it hears. This, then, is the hollow majesty, not a vacancy where a tyrant once sat, not a rot beneath gold, but a cathedral whose choir has gone and whose light still performs its ancient mathematics upon the floor. The structure stands, it even inspires. But if you call inside for the particular man who built his days beneath its arches, your voice will come back to you altered, gentler, perhaps, or further away than you expected. He lives here still. He simply occupies less room for himself than the crown requires. When the hour grows late and the room returns to breathing, he considers, without bitterness, the possibility of being forgotten, not erased, that is for traitors and fools, but absorbed into the smoothness of time, the way water, after wavering, decides at last which way the river wishes to go. It is not a frightening thought. Terror is for those who require tomorrow to mirror them. He requires only that the doors keep their hinges oiled, that bread enter ovens early, that someone read aloud to a child in a house he will never see. If these things happen after him, the echo may rest. Morning will come. The robe will be lifted. The narrow chair will accept him, the way an old road accepts a familiar cart. He will speak, and the air will behave as if it were shaped by what he says. He will sign his name, and the letters will lie neatly where he places them, and riders will move because of that lying. He will nod at music, permit a small decree that saves a larger cruelty elsewhere, refuse a petition whose cost he will pay in private. He will be majestic, which means he will be hollow, which means he will be durable enough to spare those who cannot afford erosion. He will carry the absence well, and then evening will come again, as it always does, with its sideways light and its forgiveness for colors the day makes loud. He will remove the last garment that belongs to the role and find, beneath it, the old and unkillable pulse. It will not be triumph that he feels, nor peace exactly. Something quieter, more faithful, the willingness to sit where he is, asked until the chair does not need him anymore. He will sleep, or he will hover near it, which is often enough. The castle will remember footsteps without deciding whose, and somewhere, beyond ramparts and documents and polished habit, a small boy in a village the maps ignore will hold his mother's hand at dusk and ask what the stars are. She will say, "Lights." He will say, "Whose?" She will say, "No one's, everyone's." It will be the truest answer given in the kingdom that day, and the king would agree if he heard it, but he is already drifting toward another morning. The hollow holds, the majesty stands, and inside the shape a man continues, thinner, humbler, still present, learning, late and well, that the only crown which does not bruise is the one the night places on every breathing thing. There is a kind of silence that comes only at the end of a long reign, not the tense hush before battle, nor the polite quiet of a crowded throne room. This silence is different, gentle, weightless, as if the world itself has exhaled. It hangs in the air like dusk after a storm, when nothing needs to be said because everything already has been. The king feels it first. He wakes one morning and realizes that the castle is breathing without him. The bells still ring, the kitchen still bustle, The guards still march in time, and yet it all seems to move with a rhythm that no longer depends on his heartbeat. It is then that he understands. He has become part of the scenery of his own story. The courtiers still bow, but softer now, as though afraid to wake something that is already sleeping. They speak gently, with that careful kindness people reserve for those nearing the end of something great. The king notices, but he doesn't mind. For the first time in years, he feels no need to correct them, no need to command or be obeyed. It is enough simply to watch the light fall through the tall windows, dust drifting like gold in the sun. Outside, spring has come again. He hears laughter from the courtyard, children chasing each other between the stone columns. Their shouts rise like birds into the clear air. He closes his eyes and listens. The sound feels like freedom. It reminds him of a life before the crown, before expectation. It is the most beautiful thing he has heard in years. Age has softened him in ways that power never could. The sharpness of youth, ambition, anger, fear has worn away. In their place remains something quieter, like a tide that no longer fights the shore. He moves slower now, pausing often to feel the grain of the walls beneath his fingers, to smell the cedar of old doors, to marvel that the same hands which once held swords and seals now tremble while holding a cup of tea. Each tremor feels like a truth long denied, that kings are made of the same flesh as everyone else, that no title can change the simple mathematics of time. The throne room is rarely used these days. The council meets without him more often now, deciding matters he once would have guarded like holy relics. He doesn't protest. He knows the rhythm of things, how power passes, how the river of rule always flows forward, never backward. Sometimes he walks the length of that great hall, his footsteps echoing like distant applause. He looks up at the painted ceiling, gods and heroes frozen in eternal triumph, and smiles at the irony of it. All this grandeur, and still every one of them will be forgotten, just as he will. It doesn't frighten him anymore. If anything, it comforts him. There is mercy in being forgotten. He finds himself spending more time in the gardens. The guards try to follow, of course, but he waves them off with the authority of habit. Here, among the flowers and the hum of bees, he is not king, just a man who likes the smell of earth. He kneels, painfully, to touch the soil. It crumbles between his fingers, dark and alive. He wonders when he last truly felt something living that wasn't human duty. Once, a gardener passes and freezes in shock, unsure whether to bow or speak. The king simply smiles and says, "Carry on." The man bows clumsily and hurries away, but the king notices that he hums as he works now. Perhaps kindness, like fear, echoes through stone. The days grow slower, and time begins to lose its edges. Each sunrise feels like an old friend arriving for one more conversation. The castle changes shape with the light, bright and sharp in morning, soft and golden at dusk, ghostly and translucent by night. The king begins to think of it, not as a fortress, but as a living creature that has sheltered generations of breath and memory. Sometimes, walking through its corridors, he runs his hand along the walls and whispers, "Thank you." The stones, if they could answer, would tell him they remember every word spoken in their halls, every vow, every cry, every laugh. They would tell him that no king ever truly leaves. Their voices simply sink into the foundation. He writes letters now, not decrees or commands, but small personal notes that no one expects. One to a mason who repaired the western gate, another to a widow whose son died in his army, a third to a scholar who once dared to contradict him in council. He thanks them, sincerely. Sometimes he apologizes. He does not sign them, Your Majesty. He signs them with just his name, a name he hasn't written alone in decades. The scribes are puzzled by this new habit, but they copy the letters anyway, because that is their duty. Perhaps, long after he is gone, someone will find those letters in an archive somewhere, and realize that even kings, in the end, seek forgiveness. The nights are his favorite now. When the castle grows quiet, he sits by the window and looks out across the city. The lights flicker like fireflies in the distance. He imagines families around tables, tradesmen closing their shops, a child falling asleep to the sound of his mother's song, all of it moving without him, peaceful, alive, ungoverned. It used to bother him, this distance between ruler and realm. Now he finds peace in it. to know that the world can go on without him, that life continues, quietly, beautifully, beyond the reach of any crown. That is its own kind of grace. He dreams differently now. No more of war or politics, no more of threats or treaties. In his dreams he walks barefoot through the fields of his youth. He hears the creak of wagon wheels, the buzz of summer insects, the bark of a dog long dead. He smells bread baking somewhere nearby, and he remembers the feeling of hunger, not the hunger for power, but the honest kind, the kind a loaf can cure. When he wakes, the memory lingers just long enough to make him smile. It is a good smile, the kind that asks for nothing. The crown still sits on its cushion beside his bed, but he no longer wears it except for ceremony. Even then, it feels foreign, a relic of another life. He touches it sometimes, and marvels at how heavy it once seemed, and how light it feels now. It is strange, he thinks, how power can be measured in weight. When you are young, you crave the heaviness. You want to feel its presence, to believe it gives you shape. But when you are old, you learn that the lightness that follows is the real reward. To set it down, finally, and not miss it. That is freedom. The courtiers whisper now of succession. They speak in careful tones about heirs and treaties and transitions. He listens with quiet amusement. They think he doesn't know. Of course he knows. He has lived his whole life in the company of inevitability. Sometimes they ask for his counsel, hoping to hear the wisdom of experience. He gives it to them. Short, measured, simple. He tells them that every reign begins with belief and ends with truth. That to rule well is to understand that neither lasts forever. They nod, write it down, and later quote him in speeches. They will forget what he meant, but that too is part of the pattern. One evening, as the sky blushes with sunset, he walks once more to the balcony above the city. The air is warm, filled with the scent of rain yet to come. He looks out at the roofs and streets and gardens, and feels an unfamiliar tenderness for everything, even the things that once defied him. He thinks of the builders who laid these stones, of the peasants who bent their backs for his harvests, of the lovers who met secretly in the courtyards, of the rebels who once cursed his name. They are all his now, not as subjects, but as memories, and he too belongs to them, a single thread woven through the great tapestry of their lives. When he finally falls ill, the castle moves like a body holding its breath. Doctors shuffle quietly through the halls, candles burn day and night. The priests chant soft prayers at his door, but inside the chamber, the king feels none of their fear. He is calm. He has been preparing for this for years. He asks for no crown, no scepter, only the window left open, so the evening air can drift in. He listens to the rustle of leaves, the call of a night bird somewhere far away. It sounds like a lullaby. He smiles. For once no one is watching. He can finally close his eyes without being seen, and when morning comes, the city wakes to news that does not surprise it. The bells toll slowly, their sound deep and full. The people stop in the streets, bow their heads, and whisper small prayers, not for fear but for gratitude. In taverns and marketplaces, they tell stories of him, some true, some embroidered, but all kind. They remember the justice he tried to give, the peace he kept, the patience he learned too late, but shared anyway. They speak of him not as a god, nor as a tyrant, but as a man who bore his burdens quietly, and who, at the end, set them down with grace. Years pass, new rulers rise, new wars, new faiths, new dreams. The old king's statue gathers moss in the courtyard. Children climb on his stone arms and laugh. The inscription fades until only a few letters remain. But somewhere in a garden where the soil is still rich, a rose grows in the same spot he once knelt. No one remembers why the earth there blooms so well, but it does. And that is remembrance enough, because in the end a kingdom is not remembered by its walls, nor its wars, nor even its crowns. It is remembered by the quiet traces of mercy left behind, a kind word, a spared life, a smile given when none was required. Those things outlast marble and metal. They live in whispers, in lullabies, in the gentleness of strangers toward one another. And if the king could speak now, he would say only this: be kind. That is the truest form of majesty. The castle stands empty for a while, then fills again with new voices, new laughter, New footsteps tracing the same old stones. Time smooths every scar. But when the light hits the hall in the early evening, it still glows the same way it did when he walked there. The air itself seems to remember him, not his commands, but his silences, because that is what remains, always, not the sound of power, but the quiet after it, the peace that comes when a crown finally rests. If you've drifted this far, thank you for walking through the quiet with me tonight. If you found something gentle here, a thought, a feeling, a bit of stillness, maybe leave a like, or simply let the story carry you to sleep. Close your eyes and imagine the kingdom breathing peacefully, its people safe, its lights fading one by one into the hush of evening, and somewhere, beyond time and throne and memory, a king rests, not above his people, but among them. Good night, and may your own crown, whatever shape it takes, feel lighter by morning.